Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning novel and audiobook also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest release, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I examined the Leslie and Don Corneo story section of Chapter 14, as well as some trivia from Aerith's half of the novella Traces of Two Pasts. This time around, I'll be breaking down Chapter 15, it's self-titled The Day Midgar Stood Still. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game. Anything beyond Chapter 15 is minimal and mainly speculation, but there will be some references to content from Episode Intermission and Traces of Two Pasts. As always, if you're not familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Having scaled the sector boundary outside Wall Market, using the grappling guns Leslie provided, Cloud, Tifa and Barrett find themselves in the ruined streets of the Sector 7 Plates business district. According to the area map, this is some 40 metres above ground level. It's a very powerful image to see the crumbling buildings and highways all around. In my opinion, this brings some heartbreaking context to how the collapse has affected the citizens, rather than keeping the devastation at a distance, as in the background renders of the original game. Showing how accessible the wreckage of the plate is to some denizens, even so soon after the tragedy, also helps fans of the compilation to better understand details of Denzel and Kyrie's pasts. These can be found in the official novels On the Way to a Smile and The Kids Are Alright respectively. I mentioned way back in episode 5 of this series that Denzel's chapter in On the Way to a Smile addresses what happened to many of the countless orphaned children after Meteor Fall. According to Denzel, he and a bunch of other kids lived on the streets near the Sector 7 station, eventually trading food for scrap metal and precious items they found amid the rubble of the collapsed plate. Their gang even had a name, the Sector 7 Scavengers, and the materials they sourced helped to build Edge. Similarly, it's revealed in The Kids Are Alright that Kyrie and an old friend from the slums, Fabio, begin scouring the Sector 7 ruins because there's more money to be made from precious items they find than from pickpocketing. The book refers to giant junk piles that many people go hunting through, as buyers will pay hundreds of gil for materials that are no longer commercially available in Midgar. While we are on the subject of Denzel, it's probably worth highlighting here that both his parents died when Sector 7 fell. His father, Abel, was a Shinra manager in one of their business divisions. The family lived in Sector 3 of the plate, but on the night of the collapse, Denzel's mother Chloe had been out shopping in Sector 7. Having heard whispers of an imminent attack on Sector 7, Abel leaves his son with a colleague and goes in search of his wife. Neither are seen again. Denzel, of course, later makes it to the slums and is ultimately adopted by Cloud and Tifa at the new 7th Heaven. Denzel's story has been known to us in parts since the respective releases of Advent Children and On the Way to a Smile, but he may not have been the only named character in Final Fantasy VII to have lost parents when Shinra brought down the Sector 7 plate. While the fate of Johnny's mum and dad is unclear in both the original game and remake, we can perhaps assume to some degree that Mr. and Mrs. Raspberry, Jesse's parents, have perished. Curiously, despite Jessie being a dear friend of Barrett and Tifa, and Cloud having visited her mum and dad's home in the Sector 7 employee housing district only a few nights prior, no reference is made to this in Chapter 15, or anywhere else for that matter. There's always the slim possibility that Jesse's parents were detained by Shinra after Rowan's ID was used to illegally access the munitions warehouse in Chapter 4, and were therefore not in Sector 7 at the time of the collapse. That said, I feel there's a tragic beauty in the idea that Rowan's spirit is no longer trapped. During the party's ascent, they are forced to take cover when they spot a kill team scouring the area. Veteran fans will likely have noticed the airborne weapon resembles the Heligunner boss from the old game, fought by Barrett, Aerith and Red 13 during their escape from the Shinra building. I'll come back to that later in the video though. A short distance along the crumbling tunnel, the group encounters a pair of soldier third classes. Their presence here may have come as a surprise to some players, because they don't show up until you reach the upper floors of Shinra headquarters in Final Fantasy VII. Nevertheless, their deployment is consistent with a scene in the 7th Heaven basement during the original, where the TV news report claims President Shinra has mobilised Soldier in the aftermath of the Mako Reactor 1 bombing. There are also a couple of interesting things to point out about the enemy's aesthetics. As I highlighted in my Chapter 4 breakdown, the light blue colour of their outfits reflects the original game and Crisis Core, which both used a similar shade for the third classes. What has changed, however, is the style of the uniforms. Rather than the sleeveless polo necks we're all familiar with, the soldiers are clad in something closer to riding leathers, just as Roche was. And their helmets no longer expose the lower half of their face, which does make them a touch more sinister. The soldiers also fight with the same standard issue broadswords that appeared in Crisis Core, and, believe it or not, Dirge of Cerberus before it. This is the weapon Zack, and also Angeal in some scenes, wields during the first half of Crisis Core, but it was earlier seen on the soldier trooper enemy types that Vincent faces off against in Deep Ground. Perhaps the most intriguing change, at least in the English localisation, is that the combatants are now called soldier operators, which is a term that has never been used in the compilation before. This might explain why the default battle style for Cloud, who claims to be a former soldier, is called Operator Mode. Like with most of Remake, Chapter 15 enjoys some great moments of character interactions. One of these occurs when the party has to cross a precarious metal beam, almost 150 metres in the air. Barrett tries to psych himself up by vocally repeating he shouldn't look down. This is yet another example in Remake where it's heavily implied that Barrett has a fear of heights, the first being in Chapter 6, when the trio has to creep past the ventilation fans on the plate's underside. I admittedly didn't make the connection the first time around, but it was later highlighted to me by another community member that such a fear could be explained by his experience of Shinra's attack on his hometown. Specifically, Barrett and his best friend Dine were chased along a mountain ridge and fired upon by Director Scarlet along with some infantrymen. Dine fell from the cliff, and while Barrett held on, bullets tore through his arm, causing him to let go of his friend. He may therefore associate the trauma of that incident with heights. Something that was evident but not really emphasised in the old game was the fact that Midgar is still under construction at the time of Final Fantasy VII. For any fans who weren't aware of it, it's actually director Reeve Tuesti who is in charge of this, as confirmed in a company-wide email that Zack receives during Crisis Core. Remake does a pretty decent job of bringing the sense of the city being unfinished to players. Just two examples visible from the slums are the scaffolding towers in the distance and gaps in the outer sections of the plate. There are also the construction yards dotted around, seen most prominently in the outskirts of Sector 5. Chapter 15 continues this subtext, with the party climbing around buildings and cranes owned by Shinra Construction, a subsidiary of the larger corporation, whose logo is encountered time and again. What's intriguing about this is that the wider media of Final Fantasy VII Remake provides a ton of new information about why, when and how Midgar was built. As I touched on in the last video, the Aerith half of Kazushige Nojima's most recent novella, Traces of Two Pasts, explains how Elmira's father-in-law, Gabriel Gainsborough, was one of the most successful and beloved construction business owners during the time of Midgar's erection, approximately 30 years ago. The story even delves into the inner workings of the company. However, this was not the first indication that Nojima-san had given a lot of thought to the city's origins. The Material Ultimania for Remake, released many months earlier, contains an entire timeline of the construction. I'm going to highlight some of the key points from this, but I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my good friend and Final Fantasy VII video essayist Sleep Easy for supplementing my own translation. The Material Ultimania confirms that the idea for Midgar only became a reality thanks to Shinra's discovery and development of Mako energy. Without it, technology could not be advanced quickly enough, nor could the heavy machinery required to construct such a metropolis be adequately powered. In 1969, the Midgar concept was launched by Shinra. The functioning Mako reactor on Mount Nebel had proven that enough energy could be produced to meet demand, but at a cost. The company had recorded adverse effects on the environment around the reactor facility. To combat the impact of this in Midgar, it was decided that an elevated plate was to be constructed, differentiating the living standards of those on the plate and those below, and deliberately breeding competition. The land around Midgar was already a known hotspot for monsters, so to ensure the effectiveness of the labourers, Shinra first built a perimeter wall. For power, Mako Reactor 0 was established at the centre of the location. Dirge of Cerberus fans will likely note that this is the same facility Vincent later visits at the heart of Deepground. Over time, Midgar's central pillar was erected around it, offering both security and secrecy. By 1974, Reactors 1 and 2 were in operation, and work had commenced on the Sector 1 upper city that would be wedged between the two. Midgar was enjoying an influx of labourers whose makeshift homes and small-scale commercial and entertainment areas were the foundation of the slums. Workers and building materials were transported to the plate by train, so a functioning railway system was prioritised. The marshalling yard and a depot for goods arriving from outside the city were located in Lower Sector 7, the area we now know as the train graveyard. The final Mako reactor to go into operation was number 8, sometime in 1976. This heralded the immigration of Shinra employees, middle-class citizens, and businesses to the plate. In effect, anyone deemed valuable to the company. With a growing population and space on the upper city at a premium, Shinra's plan for social inequality began to bear fruits, and the slums were established in the shadow of the plate. However, before anyone could move onto the Sector 6 upper city, disaster struck. In what was understood to be an accident caused by the load of the plate not being properly supported, much of the sector collapsed. Miraculously, there were few casualties, as the residential districts were almost entirely empty. In the aftermath, Shinra chose to delay allocating a budget to the restoration of Sector 6, instead prioritising work on the company's headquarters, industry, and commercial districts on the plate. And, as we've known since the original Final Fantasy VII, the wreckage is still there in the present day. I touched on this back in the first part of my Chapter 9 video trilogy, but there's evidence in the old game to suggest that a similar story had at least been considered by the writers. When the player reaches the 65th floor of Shinra headquarters, there is a small minigame where they must collect parts to complete a scale model of Midgar's plate, and there is a gaping hole on the model where Sector 6 should be. The subject is far better addressed in Remake, however, with snippets of history being offered by the NPCs of Center District. As the party nears the summit of the Sector 7 ruins, they pause again to survey the scale of the destruction below. It's a poignant moment that was not really afforded to the player in the original Final Fantasy VII, because the ascent to the plate only lasted a few screens, and the painted 2D background couldn't fully convey the utter devastation. In my opinion, the soft colours of sunset really add to the emotion. Barrett remarks that they'll build another bar, which links back to Chapter 13, when the trio discovered the remains of Seventh Heaven. This seems to lift Tifa's spirit a little, and she asks if Cloud will help too. Cloud responds with, "For a price," which is a nod to the end of Chapter 14, and the blonde mercenary being teased for being a nice guy at heart, as I spoke about in my last video. Some fans may have found it slightly jarring that the focus of the conversation in this moment is Seventh Heaven, rather than the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, or even their comrades, Biggs and Jesse. Especially after Remake has yet again created an entire chapter's worth of content out of what was effectively a small puzzle to bridge the sections. A bit more context for this was provided during Tifa's story in Traces of Two Pasts. In short, Seventh Heaven was the first place since the traumatic events at Nibelheim, where she lost her father and sustained a near fatal wound from Sephiroth, that Tifa truly felt safe. She had sacrificed years of savings to buy the bar after its previous owner died, so that Barrett and Marlene could sleep in the basement. As such, Seventh Heaven was also quite literally his home. What the bar represents to the characters, therefore, holds far deeper importance than meets the eye. The scene, of course, is also one big reference to Advent Children, or, more specifically, its official companion novel, On the Way to a Smile. Advent Children shows that within 2 years of Final Fantasy VII's ending, a new Seventh Heaven has been built in Edge, the town that forms on the periphery of Midgar's slums. Tifa's chapter in the book, however, explains how she, Barrett and Cloud come to co-own the establishment. While it isn't their original agenda, they secure the funds and materials needed to rebuild Seventh Heaven by helping people out around Edge. This brings us all the way back to Denzel, who I spoke of earlier in the video, because he eventually comes to live with Cloud and Tifa at the bar, after fending for himself as an orphan for almost 2 years. And finally, at the climax of the chapter, the party is forced to battle the Valkyrie. The automatous airborne weapon shows up a few times throughout the trio's ascent, none more memorable than the bullet dodge section. Like I mentioned previously, some fans will have recognised the Valkyrie as Heligunner, a boss that is fought in the elevators while the group tries to escape from Shinra headquarters in the original game. What's curious about the weapon's name is that it's a localisation, because the Japanese version of Remake does still call it Heligunner. The Valkyries are divine shield maidens from Norse mythology, whose principal role is to collect the souls of slain warriors from the battlefield. This doesn't quite apply to the current scenario, suggesting the origin of the name actually relates to Richard Wagner's operatic piece Ride of the Valkyries. The music is probably best known in pop culture from the movie Apocalypse Now, where it's blared through speakers on military helicopters, hence the connection. The Valkyrie's inclusion in this chapter does actually make sense from a narrative perspective though, because A, its aerial capabilities create a realistic pursuit of the party, and B, the context of battling heavy weapons across 2 elevators, as in the old Final Fantasy VII, wouldn't translate particularly well. Meanwhile, Remake's PlayStation 5 DLC, Episode Intermission, takes the finer details of the narrative one step further. During Yuffie's exploration of the Materia Research Facility 24 hours earlier, the Valkyrie can be seen in a hangar below. We know the facility is located somewhere inside Midgar's central pillar, suggesting the weapon has been deployed directly from there in Chapter 15. In addition to this, Yuffie also discovers a selection of smaller variants to the Valkyrie with slightly different designs. This may be a callback to Crisis Core, where Zack can encounter various models, such as the Flying Machine, Sky Gunner, Sky Armour, and Spitfire. Well guys, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from Chapter 15. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as a special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon, the address for which is noted at the end of this video. I would additionally like to thank KupoCon for commissioning the series and encourage all viewers to support their channel and brand. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.